So in this inquiry, in this investigation, it's useful to understand that in terms of these two modes of relating to experience, of orienting to experience, the one mode that is in terms of interpreting it, having an interpretational framework and having it be relational to other characteristics and so on and so forth, versus the mode of just open presence with the actuality. It's important to understand, or I should say it's useful to understand, that you're not trying to get away from the interpretive mode and get towards the open mode. You want to definitely orient towards the open mode, but that doesn't necessarily mean getting away from the interpretational mode, because they coexist. And getting away from the orienting anyway away from the interpretational mode gives it more power, because orienting away from it is actually orienting towards it. In other words, your orientation is relative to it, and you want to just ignore it, bypass it completely, one way or the other. Let it have free sway, lighten up with it, loosen up with it, let it be, let it run on automatic pilot, so to speak. And then, anytime you find yourself having some free attention or what have you, let your attention go towards a more neutral, open-ended presence of some experiential actuality, as we talked about this morning. But you're not trying to get from one thing to another where the one is bad and the other is good. It's not like that at all. That just reinforces, and that's just generating another interpretational framework, which of course is not getting you anywhere. A sort of a metaphor I often use that I think is useful is the metaphor of a matador in a bullfight. So the bull's rushing at this guy. He doesn't have to stop the bull. All he has to do is get out of the way at the last minute, and the bull goes rushing by. So likewise, you don't have to stop the interpretational orientation to your experience. You don't have to do anything to it. You just sort of look over here. So here you're doing a very heavy-handed investment in your soap opera and your curriculum vitae and your likes and your dislikes and your aspirations and your dreads and the whole soap opera, the whole you show going on with a cast of thousands. So that's all going on here. Fine, what's happening over here? And so you don't need to stop that. You just check out over here for a little while.
Olay.
Olay, yes, olay. Right. So it's a kind of there's an artfulness of the looseness of being with it you can discover, which makes it both easy and fun, and it's not like you're taking on the entire edifice of your habitual, or your habits of orienting to yourself as your life, which is this huge monolithic thing, which is basically liable to be difficult to challenge right off the bat, let's say. Because these interpretational frameworks, these orientational modes of being with your experience, always exist within the context of your actual open-ended experience, which is always the ever-present context and environment within which these other modes may seem to be occurring. So it's always available, it's always right there. And as I mentioned this morning, you're already, in fact, always engaged with these more open modes. But typically, unless you're an artist or a tripper or something, we don't usually give these other, these more open modes much attention, because they seem to be relatively uneventful relative to the juiciness of our soap opera. One great facilitator for this yoga is the best and most useful attitude or stance with regard to it is a light and playful approach. You approach it in the spirit of playfulness and lightness and artistry rather than serious, plodding, duty-bound, goal-oriented process. So if you're sort of light and loose and playful and spontaneous with it, you'll find that to be by far the most productive mood that will allow for inspiration and intuition and spontaneity most effectively. So anything on your mind?
Just in regards to what you were saying and what we were speaking of earlier. So what I've been playing with in the break was, so like that fear arises and if I'm just with it, I'm just with it, not with it, but being with the largeness, the spaciousness. Like I noticed that like the physiological experience, the sensation is still there, but then like if I'm not in, so this is kind of what I'm getting from listening to, like I'm not interpreting that sensation,
Right.
and then I'm with the actual sensation, and then realizing that there's so much more to that sensation.
Yeah.
Like there's so much like I could just call that fear.
Yeah.
And then it's like I think I know what it is, and I kind of think I got a handle on it. But it's actually much vaster, the actual sensing of it, that I don't even quite know where the boundary of it is.
Yeah, for sure. When you look at fear and anxiety, these kind of things, you look at what's actually there, you discover there's this rush of energy and this sort of excitement and this sort of, like you're sort of turned on, or it's a whole gestalt of inconceivable qualities. And to sort of call it fear and not like it is really shortchanging it. And then in that context, it stops mattering. It just becomes an aspect of the energy. And in fact, it's a kind of an energizing and vitalizing energy.
I'm noticing like bliss, like there's like the sensation actually takes on a blissful.
Well, it is.
quality.
All energy is ultimately bliss. All sensation is ultimately ecstasy.
Wow.
I mean, just the tingling of what is present, the sparkling of, all experience is a dynamic energy.
Wow.
No experience is static. It's all dancing and tingling and, just any sensation. You feel what sensation is. You listen to what sound is. It's amazing vibration. Look at light. It's just incredibly high frequency. I mean, it's all vibrating and shaking and dancing, and it's pure bliss. It's pure ecstasy. And of course, when you let yourself go more directly to the experiential actuality itself, this becomes more noticeable, more obvious, and of course then you get to partake of that, and how nice,
So Peter, where does our conception and reality is pain fit into that. It's another sensation, another dance.
Yeah.
And I know maybe months ago you mentioned something in your experience of going into it almost like going into a flame or a humming, buzzing thing there. And did it calm down? Did it change?
Not necessarily. I mean, when as we were just talking, going into the actual experience of one of these qualities doesn't necessarily change or ameliorate the quality, but what you're holding it to be is revealed to be absurdly partialized, and what it actually is turns out to have qualities that vastly transcend what you're holding it to be. So pain, even severe pain, is in many ways a kind of a rush of bliss and ecstasy and weird, which will not necessarily cause it to stop, but certainly reveals it in a different context. Pain cannot necessarily be stopped by yoga, but suffering can. Because suffering is always a fantasy oriented around supposedly undesirable conditions. So suppose you have pain. The pain is one thing, but the suffering is, oh, woe is me. I shouldn't be having this pain. I wish I wasn't having this pain. This really sucks. Boy, things would be so much better if I wasn't having this pain, but I'm having it, so things really suck. So you're basically creating a whole soap opera, a whole narration for yourself that you then immerse yourself in the narrative, which sort of becomes a self-verifying downer, self-verifying unpleasant experience. But it's being created and generated and boosted by the whole narration, which is dependent upon interpreting the presence, the experiential presence, as being this, that, and that. Oh, this is pain. It's happening to me. It shouldn't be happening to me. I mean, every one of these factors are absurd. So if you break that chain anywhere, and probably the easiest place to do it is by looking at the experiential presence itself of the trigger impulse, you might say. Like in the case of pain, look at what the experience actually is. It opens up. It becomes, it assumes an entirely different aspect. And in the implications of that, all that narrative just seems absurd and trivial and childish. And it spontaneously diminishes in impact. Again, it's not, the point isn't to address the narrative. The point is to bypass it, go into the openness, and that spontaneously will diminish the relevance of the narrative. So you're solving the problem without addressing the problem. You solve the problem by bypassing it, and what you find there spontaneously deflates the obsession.
And bypassing it is noticing the narrative or seeing
No, forget about the narrative.
Oh.
You go to the actual experiential presence. Screw the narrative. The narrative will take care of itself. Doesn't need any attention from you.
Well, I have a question about that. I'm, working with people, and they're very fixated on the narrative. And I'm with you on not stopping the narrative, but maybe just seeing that it is a narrative. Would that be a good suggestion?
From the point of view of therapy, maybe, or something, but from the point of view of liberation, you have to see why the narratives are relevant. And to see why the narratives are relevant, you have to see that what the narrative is actually pretends to be about doesn't exist in the way the narrative phrases it or parses it. Experience doesn't exist in the way our descriptions of it imply. And when you see that, then the narration, the description is left hanging. It doesn't, it's like, well, I'm describing a certain thing, and that thing doesn't exist. This exists, which is entirely different. So where does that leave my description? I mean, it's just floating here, disconnected, without a leg to stand on. So it tends to dissipate.
Maybe likewise, the question is going into the pleasure, whether it be a tantric process or in anything of that, how would, if there sounds pretty similar.
Always, it's exactly the same. This is the point. You go into the pleasure of any experience. All experience is ultimately pleasurable. I mean, this is the basis of Tantra. All experience is really pure pleasure. And when you discover that fact, then naturally it ceases to exist as a problem. And there goes suffering. There goes poor pitiful me. You know, all of this has to do with the nature of radiance, the nature of energy. What is here, all of this that is here right now, all this actuality is the presence of a transcendental energy. Literally, not theoretically, it is. This is all, you're being zapped. You're being zapped by all of this energy. That's literally what it is. It's an energy presence. And this energy is not hidden. It's not concealed. It's only disguised because you're busy misdescribing it to yourself. But in actual fact, it's right here. It's out in the open. What it is plain to see. And when you notice this, the flavor of this energy, you notice it's pure pleasure. It's pure ecstasy. It's just this amazing, light show, psychedelic light show for your benefit, for your joy. Literally. I mean, it happens to be that. Not that you need to describe it that way or convince yourself it's that way. Just look and see what it is and check it out. What is it that is here? How is it that it is here? And you'll discover that it's this amazing, bizarre energy presence. Inconceivable, indescribable. How it's happening is beyond imagination. It's pure miracle. And yet it's actual, it's explicit. It's right here, right now, this is it. And it's not hidden. It's only hidden by its own weirdness and by the fact that you're maybe in the habit of misdescribing it to yourself and believing your own bad descriptions. But it's pure energy, it's pure pleasure, it's just tingling. It's this bzzz, it's stimulation. It's stimulation in the purest sense. It's just pure stimulation. There's nothing here but stimulation. It doesn't, and nothing's made of it. It doesn't build up anything. It's just raw stimulation, bang. And the imagination pretends to turn it into all of these things that are supposedly made of this energy. But there's no things and there's no made of. There's just energy. It's just raw energy presence. That's all there is here. But again, the point isn't the idea of that. The point is it's possible for you to check it out and investigate for yourself and discover that is in fact the case. And then the implications of that are drastically different than the implications of our usual horror story of our global situation and human situation and our miserable lives and so on and so forth.
The interpretation itself is actually, if you're not getting duped by the content, it's actually pretty mind-blowing.
Of course, the interpretation is itself
Just the way it
pure
rises.
energy, and it's evidence of this inconceivable inherent intelligence that the energy embodies and is made of. So it's a win. It's a staggering miracle all the way down. There's a lot of ways to approach this. Obviously, you can look at the different spiritual traditions and look at these things. And some of them sort of jump right in the deep end and, go right to tantric energy presence in the void, which is just like, wow, that's pretty weird. That's pretty far out. Or you can start at the other end with your normal experience and sort of, get your foot, cautiously let your big toe dip in the water for a second to feel the temperature and then do it from that end. But ultimately, it's the same thing, and it goes the same place. And what this actually is farther out than far out. I mean, it really is. But there's no point even talking about it. Look and see for yourself.
So I'm just going to share that I was talking with a client of mine, and we were exploring these matters and struggling with some stuff in her life and looking at her own experience, inviting her to look at her experience and see the ways in which it couldn't really be captured by her descriptions. And I was using an example of, the taste of food. I said, you taste an orange, and try to characterize what that is descriptively. And she, on the one hand, she was like, yeah, I see what you mean. And then she said, but it's very distinctive. It tastes just like an orange. And it's different from some other thing, like a lemon, a carrot. And we were just exploring, and I have been looking as well at how just amazing to me the paradox of that is. Yes. That it feels like, same thing with color, let's say, that that color is completely distinct from that color. Yeah. And yet at the same time I can't say what it actually is. Exactly so. Even though it's precise in its distinctiveness. Exactly so. This is the paradox of the coexistence of absolute specificity and absolute unresolvability. To sort of sloppy human thinking, specificity and unresolvability seem like they'd be opposites. But in fact, they are not. They are one and the same thing. So this presents with absolute differentiation and absolute specificity of differentiation, and yet every single portion of this absolute specific differentiation is unresolvable. Without negating, that fact doesn't negate the specificity.
How's that possible?
It's not possible. It makes no sense. It's irrational. It's not a logical construct. It's just a fact. It's just how it is. I mean, this is part of the illustration of the miraculousness and the weirdness of the divine, of what this is. That, how could that be? Well, it can't. There's no way that makes any sense. And yet, check it out.
Right. It's like each of those distinctive, qualities of experience, like a color or a taste of something, I cannot say what it is. I can't define it. I can't really put it into any framework. And yet there it is, distinctively just itself. Exactly. An orange is an orange.
Yeah.
But I can't, if I attempt to break, tell you what that actually is, or then it falls apart. I can't.
But even beyond undescribability, exactly what it is unresolvable in terms experientially, even beyond describability. So in other words, an orange, you have a particular orange. That orange is exactly that orange, and the flavor of that orange is precisely, specifically, exactly what it is. Okay, what is it? Without not to have an undescribability, but just what is that? So you taste it, and the closer you look, the more you find. It's like to a simplistic logic, you'd expect that the closer you look at something, the more and more it would cohere into some essence of what it is. But what actually happens is exactly the opposite. The closer you look into any experience, the more it diverges. The more you find, and what you find doesn't necessarily line up with anything else that you're finding. And if you go chasing off any of these partialities, they diverge. And then you chase any of those and they diverge. So you end up anywhere. You can start anywhere and end up anywhere else. But you will not end up anywhere in particular. You won't end up with, yes, this is this.
So you can't really say whether it's reality is coherent or incoherent.
Can't. It's both. It depends on how you look at it. It presents as, you can find as much coherence as you want, and all of that coherence is ultimately incoherent.
Right.
And vice versa, you can find as much incoherence as you want, and all that incoherence is ultimately coherent. And it doesn't make any sense at all.
But experientially, it makes perfect sense.
Well, it's how it is.
It feels like how it is.
It is how it is. Reality is that way. Reality, it's the job of logic to conform to reality, not reality's job to conform to logic. And we make a fallacy when we say it couldn't be like that. That doesn't make any sense. It's like, no. You're right. Have the structures of making sense be derived from actuality, not the other way around. It's a pretty arrogant thing to start to dictate to reality how it ought to be.
I like the word supralogical because it transcends it.
Yeah.
Transcends it. The logic is there. It's not busted by it, but it just transcends it.
Well, it has its own logic, and you have to learn the logic. To understand reality, you have to learn the logic of reality, which is a logic of infinity. It's a logic of paradox. It's a logic of both and. It's not a logic of either or.
When you use like plant medicine, like ayahuasca and stuff, it seems to bypass all of that, so that you see how your thoughts manifest things.
Right.
And when you think of a plant being a teacher, you can't really experience that until you've experienced it. You don't understand how that could possibly be. But when you experience, light trailers and all of this stuff happening, you know that that's probably there, even though we can't see it. But this somehow can adjust the brain, or I think it's made me see through the illusion a lot more than I would have without it.
Sure. Yeah. There's no limit to the ways this can be experienced, and experiencing it through different drug orientations reveals these different aspects of what this is, and they're all genuine and they're all authentic, but they're all different.
They're all different, yeah.
And no one is truer than any other one, but they all reveal different aspects. And none of the aspects that they reveal are ultimately resolvable as to what they are. They all ultimately reveal mystery. But it's advantageous. It's great to explore this from as many perspectives as you can, because it's our own provincialism, it's our own experiential provincialism that limits us. We only see our experience in one small way. We're living a small life, or may think we are. Whereas if
you see how three-dimensional and how your sight can expand on a level that you couldn't even perceive.
Yeah, sure. And there's these kinds of chemically induced altered states. There's all kinds of other ways of inducing altered states. And in fact, your state of normalcy actually is made up of altered states. And this is also directly discoverable by looking more closely. But by exploring, seeking you will find. By exploring, by looking at your experience freshly from these different perspectives, you can discover the ways in which it's beyond what you may be used to holding it to be. And all of these modes of exploration are valid, depending upon how if you use them with intelligence.
Let me ask you about, I guess this falls under the fuck it mantra. Because there's a lot of times when talking about this stuff, it tends to, one can tend to take it into sort of a developmental model, as opposed to sort of like, fuck it, and just rest your way into it. Not that something's revealed by just dropping the whole project. I wonder if you could address that a little bit.
All modes are valid. It really depends on your own artfulness with your ability to employ them. And dropping it and saying fuck it is a very powerful mode, as is, studious investigation, as is this, as is that. And you don't need to limit yourself to one mode. You can multitask or you can alternate. The sky's the limit.
Sounds kind of like all modes are like musical instruments. You can choose the violin or the guitar or the harp, and they all play music, but they all get to express it or go from a little different point of departure. But
the trick is to be artful and discover employing these modes in a way which is most productive for you, given your skill set and your intelligence and so on and so forth. I mean, ultimately, for better or for worse, ultimately the brunt of this investigation is thrown upon the genius of the investigator. It's virtually impossible to formalize it and to make a one-size-fits-all laundry list of, well, if you do this and then you do this and then you do this, you'll figure it out. It's like, no, there's all these different modes, and you have to discover for yourself where the rubber's hitting the road. And it's going to be different for everyone, because you have your own genius, you have your own strengths and weaknesses. And the trick is to find modes that bypass your weaknesses and play to your strengths, which will again be different for everyone. For some people, fuck it is going to work in spades. For other people, it's not particularly going to work at all. Or for most of us, both, or whatever.
so there's never a moment where intelligence is not present.
Never.
Or involved. So in a way, anything one does, other than maybe certain things are attractive, then that seems to be the intelligence speaking to us, whether it's...
Yeah, everything is intelligence speaking. To it, not to you so much as to itself, but you are it, so that's different, it's playing with words. But there's nothing that's not intelligence dancing with itself. And again, the point is to notice that, not to steer it.
Could you say a little bit more about not to steer it?
No.
Just one more sentence.
Steering is actually fine. So it doesn't matter what you do. The point is to notice it by hook or by crook. Notice that this is intelligence playing with itself. And if hands off, it facilitates that, great. If hands on facilitates that, great. There's no laws or rules. It's just a matter of what works. And that's where you have to have some sensitivity and some inspiration and some sensitivity to notice what is working and then for you and maximize it, because everyone's unique. What works for you is not going to be what works for someone else, necessarily.
A question. There's a way that it feels like, or it seems that there are, like in psychology, they call them complexes or things like that sort of like bind or not the thinning out or expansiveness of the consciousness. And a lot of those are like in the unconscious, that's a debatable thing, because where do you find this mysterious unconscious? But so that's a sort of a question of mine. It's in my own work, I find that there's some kind of thing on the surface, and if I go into it, it opens up to some unconscious thing, and if I can get into it, it opens up and it releases, and it's like part of my consciousness was frozen or stuck there, and now I'm freer or something.
Right.
And so I wonder how that relates to what you're saying.
It's the same. It's really a matter of finding the point of attack that's most efficient. So one can approach things, and from a psychological point of view, sort of serially, taking one complex after another and going into it as you're describing and doing that. And this can be productive, because ultimately, when you look at anything that is an actuality in your experience, when you look at it very closely and intelligently, it will reveal that it is different than it seemed to be, and it will, as you say, open up. Or an alternative approach might be to look somewhere else entirely that has nothing to do with the complexes, like I was speaking about earlier. Look at some neutral, objective apparition within your experience that has absolutely no, you have absolutely no involvement with one way or the other, and notice that what that is, and notice how that opens up with the same basic intelligent observation, intelligent engagement. And as one discovers that opening, what applies there applies everywhere across the board. When one discovers that nothing is what one thinks it is, then everything one thinks lightens up, without having to approach it serially. Well, I've solved that problem. Now what's the next in line? Now what's next? This. Because if you approach things serially, you're liable to find your list goes on forever. Whereas if you approach it structurally, that nothing whatsoever is the way I think it is, then that applies across the board, and all the entire list gradually ramps itself up into irrelevance.
Very cool.
But it's down to the artfulness of the explorer to discover a way to pull that off, a way to have that be efficacious.
Yeah, and so there's something about that universality to the. And what would you say that is? What is it that's being noticed in all the different particulars that's common to all of them? That sort of,
It's the nature of the unresolvability of actuality, the unresolvability of experience. And all of these complexes and all of this orientation is predicated on pretending they are resolvable, pretending this is this way and that is that way, and I can know what that is. Whereas the actual condition of experience is not like that. And so when one looks and discovers that that is the case, that experience is not resolvable, then all of the structures and arguments based upon the supposed resolvability just lose their credibility. They may or may not all dissolve and release totally, but they certainly would lighten up by degrees. Because it applies across the board that actuality is unresolvable. And all structures and all definitions and all orientations are dependent upon resolvability. You have to know what something is to orient to it. And if something is a contact point for unresolvability, basically it's an infinity. You don't know what it is, because it is what it is, but it's not any simple particular thing. And everything is actually like that. And when you discover that, then all the particulars that are the foundation and the anchors of all of your structures are kind of cast adrift. But again, you have to, and that's not theoretically, you have to, for it to be powerful, you have to discover it experientially. You have to discover the actuality, the way that this is so. And then it has potency.
Yeah, just as you were talking, I was noticing a particular experience, and there was a slight losing of confidence in believing it to be what
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
Because all belief is predicated upon resolvability. To believe in something, there has to be a particular something that you're believing in.
Yeah, it's sort of like a losing confidence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one discovers this, even if one is a really assiduous yogi and really proceeds on this path very, very diligently and with great effectiveness, there still may be all sorts of orientational structures that are residual within the personality and the habitual way of orienting to experience. But they become more and more ghost-like and less having anything hang on them. They lose all their urgency, they lose their relevance. They may or may not stop, they may or may not dissipate, but after a while they just become less and less relevant, so what? Yeah, I'm still a neurotic jerk, but so what? I don't care. No one else cares.
So it'd almost be like climbing the ladder of a what do you call it? The things that on the piano, the pendulum. So you climb to the top of the pendulum and where you can just sit in quietness, and then the pendulum just opens up and goes out into the universe from there.
Sure. Why not? That's good.
So is it helpful to be aware? I mean, this will sound conceptual, so maybe you'll bear with me or not. To be aware, I know.
Fair enough.
When you talked about our orientation, when we're going about our day, we might not even be thinking or noticing or even aware I have an orientation.
Of course.
Is it helpful to become aware of that orientation, or is it kind of irrelevant?
Well, the best way to become aware of that orientation is to notice what is not within it.
To notice what's not within it.
Yeah. And because then by contrast, it will become clear. Orientations are invisible from within themselves because they verify themselves.
It's like what we believe. My orientation is like the way I believe things are.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And typically, since it's the way you believe things are, it's invisible because it's just the way things are.
Exactly.
But the more familiar you become with alternatives, with what's outside that, with unqualified experience, then from that perspective, that casts your interpretive frameworks, that casts your relational interpretations in contrast, and you can see what they are more clearly.
So that would be like noticing the speck of dirt with soft eyes, or
Anything, whatever. You play with techniques, and you discover by being artful and by being intelligent and by being lucky, you discover ways that are powerful, ways that actually reveal rather than just being games you're playing with yourself.
Start with a game and
but you have to stumble on it.
Yeah.
But sincerity is certainly a good basis for proceeding, and playfulness is always the best attitude. It's a nice sound, isn't it?
It goes on and on.
Peter, you might have already gone into this. I just got here for the afternoon. Like when you say unresolvability,
Yeah.
Did you go into that earlier? Like, so it's like when you're saying that, it's basically seeing that everything's a mystery.
Yes, essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Unresolvability is the linchpin and the most important thing to understand about all this. It's the most important thing to understand about the nature of reality. Not just as an abstraction. It's fine to understand it as an abstraction, as a jumping off point for your investigation. But for it to be powerful, you have to discover what it actually is in experience. And unresolvability means essentially mystery. When you look at precisely what anything is, it seems to be the way it seems to be. When you look closer to try and pin it down, well, exactly what is it? So the more closely one engages with it, with sensitivity and intelligence, one will discover that what is actually there is an incredible richness. There's all sorts of qualities that don't necessarily align with each other coherently. And when you look even closer, you discover even more qualities. And the qualities tend to open into newness and whole different kinds of qualities that you might not have initially suspected you would find are going to be there, and so on and so forth. And any and all actual experience seems to be like this, where the closer you look at it, the more you find in ways that don't converge. In other words, you keep finding more and more information, and more and more information, and more and more information, and it doesn't necessarily correlate. It's like trying to analyze a taste. You take a sip of hot chocolate, say, or whatever, and you taste it, and the first hit is that, oh, it tastes this way, and then you taste very carefully. Oh, wow, there's all of these little subtle undertones and notes and echoes, and then you taste even more and try and pin down even one of the little side echoes and harmonics, and it goes off into even more and even more and even more. And after a few minutes of this, you can sit back and say, so what does it taste like? And you don't know. And the closer you look, the less you know what it tastes like in a way, because it opens up and diverges from itself so much. And so this is, essentially a principle like this is what I refer to as unresolvability. And this is, if you look into it, I think you will find across the board, every single bit of your actual experience is like that. So the implications of this, as we were speaking just a few minutes ago, is that all of our pretense definition, where we think we know what things are, and we think this is this and that's that, and then we have interrelationships between them, and we form opinions based upon the interrelationships, and this whole relational structure we erect in our imaginations about the way things are and the way they work, is all bullshit. It's all hogwash, because all of that's predicated on resolvability, on pinning down exactly what anything is. And when you look at anything, you discover you can't pin down exactly what it is. So by implication, powerfully by implication, all of these relational structures are just absurd. They're partializations. They're not wholly untrue necessarily, but they certainly don't capture the whole truth, in a very strong sense. And so then one becomes freed from the rigidity of these various interpretive frameworks and discovers the arbitrariness of them. So, which in practice is useful because you can let yourself use multiple contradictory interpretive frameworks at your convenience and so on. Politicians are very skilled at this. But ultimately, you discover that because in a sense of self-image, from a spiritual point of view, these interpretive frameworks is what we feel stuck in. Is what is called, technically in spirituality, is called delusion. It's called samsara, where you think you are a certain way and you feel stuck in that way and you feel pain as a result of being stuck in that. And when you discover through investigation that the resolvability that all of these interpretive frameworks are based on doesn't actually exist objectively, then all of these interpretive frameworks dissolve in relevance, and you discover you're not stuck, you're not what you thought you were, you don't know what you are, and in that openness is freedom and possibility and spontaneity and vitality and beauty and so on and so forth.
If there's some piece that I'm missing, because what I'll do is I can go into a particular structure, and it's exactly like you were saying. It's like there's a contracted and there's an affect or a feeling and a content and as I get into it and it releases, I saw that part of me was believing somehow that was me, like there was a way I was identifying without even knowing it.
Right.
And there is like some invisible film that's lifted, and that happens with these different structures. But there's a way that's not generalized. There is a way, because it's like a whole. There's like the whole being is lighter.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's generalizing.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily apply instantaneously across the board. It may seem to apply gradually or incrementally over a long period of time. But so typically in these kinds of investigations, when you look at something that you hold to be a certain way and you discover it isn't that way, that generates a freedom from that and generates a lightness there. And that lightness will tend to translate across the board to some degree.
Yeah.
Typically, for most people, I would say, their experience will look like a series of these investigations, a series of these discoveries, a series of these lightnings, which cumulatively result in ever more and more lightning.
Yeah.
And typically, for most people, it's not like a flash of lightning where you see it and all of a sudden everything dissolves. Although that can happen. There's no rules.
Yeah, it's much more like that, and I have the sense that there's a way that it could generalize, and that you're pointing to.
Yeah.
There's a way that could happen.
Yeah. But by and large, I would say the more you chip away intelligently with this kind of investigation and discover this, the way we're holding things to be, it doesn't actually exist experientially. The more one does that, the more it will have a cumulative effect.
Particularly that it's a fixed thing that whatever it is that my mind is taking it to be,
Exactly.
believing that.
Exactly. Which is actually the sole problem in life. The sole problem in life is thinking we know what's going on. And when you discover you don't know what's going on, what a load off. Because you discover you don't know what you are, you don't know what your life is, you don't know what your circumstances are, you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going, you don't know where you are. And that discovery turns out to be absolutely wonderful. On the contrary to the trite fantasy that it would be horrible. Oh no, I don't know where I am. I've lost everything. What's happening here? Oh no. It's exactly the opposite. When one gets out from under all of this constricting pretense and arrogance that pretending you know what's going on, pretending you know what you are, it's beautiful. It's delightful.
And even that getting out from under anything is not a knowing either. It still is just more like
more
stuff
weirdness
going off into infinity.
Yeah, everything. I mean, stuff going off into infinity is pretty much what we got. Before, during, and after.
It's not bad.
Well, if it is bad, we're just shit out of luck.
So what?
At least you can't tell if it is bad.
Yeah.
So I know fundamentally that all experience is just unbearably intimate. I mean, and that there's no way a word you go into words for any of that is just like total impossible. So I know that.
Yeah, of course you do.
And experience that. And sometimes that's more accessible. And maybe it's because it's unbearable or seemingly unbearable. Just that you sort of pop out of it, and it's the accumulation thing, like you chip away at it and it becomes more or acclimatized to it. But I find it interesting that it's something that's so baseline like that is so seemingly fleeting as well.
Well, but the way in which it's fleeting is largely liable to be an implication of subtle conditions you're holding to be the case. They give you a relational fulcrum for it to be here or not here.
Mm.
And that might not be apparent. It might not be obvious exactly what that is.
Could you give an example of what the condition might be?
No, it could be anything. Anything that seems to be a certain way can become a pebble that you can trip on from any direction. So it can be a tiny little thing, and it can come up the whole word.
No, I think that's actually, not from exactly that specific vantage that I'm talking from right now, but I've had the thing where, it's like that, and that becomes another reference point, which kills everything after that.
Yeah, exactly. And these reference points can come with increasing subtlety.
Mm.
They can come with such subtlety and ingenuity that you don't even notice they're reference points because they seem to be so wonderful and open-ended and infinite. But the intelligence is so powerful, they can have really convincing fantasies of open-ended and wonderful and infinite that is actually taking to be a thing. And as soon as it becomes thingified, you're screwed. I mean, you're not actually screwed, fortunately, but it may seem that you are.
You often talk about how identification can be a real stumbling block.
Yeah.
And that there's actually entities that.
Yeah. And it's insidious because if there's one thing, then there's everything. If there's one thing that is a certain way, then that implies an entire universe.
Yeah.
It's like poof, all of a sudden, there you are stuck again in the middle of this morass of infinity of difficult circumstances you have to wade through. Just because there's one thing. That one thing is bang, a holographic fractal implication that just comes up the word speaking.
So everything's a linchpin.
Everything's a linchpin, but nothing's really a linchpin because nothing is actually an entity.
Okay.
That's the good news.
That is the good news.
But also understanding is a linchpin. You
Yeah.
think that you understand.
Yeah, but if you think anything, you're screwed.
Yeah.
Because thinking it is entifying it, whether or not it's a thing in some kind of concrete sense or an objective, material sense. If anything seems to be, if anything is held to be a certain way, then that's going to screw you up. But the good news is it doesn't matter. The good news is you just keep exploring unresolvability. And the unresolvability is a magical formula which dissolves everything. The alchemists had all sorts of wonderful euphemisms for discovering it. There was the universal solvent. But all of this wonder, all this delightful mythology and abstraction just refers to the simple, concrete fact of the way you orient to your experience. And the fact that if you're orienting to your experience any way at all, you're pretending to. Because it's impossible to orient to your experience because there's nothing there stable enough to orient to.
Oh, no.
So it's bootstrapped up out of your ass, figuratively speaking, in most cases.
funny when you see sometimes, like you see in religions and spiritual teachings of sort of devotion of bowing down and pranaming and these things, and sometimes it just seems like that's the most natural response to the miraculous nature.
Well, it
just
is.
feels like it almost literally bodily sometimes rises up like that, like, oh my God.
Absolutely, and that's
like,
appropriate. There's nothing wrong with that. I've done that. You know, it's viable. It's true. I mean, this is the shit. And if it doesn't knock your socks off, you got some tough socks there, baby. And any response is appropriate. You know, burst in tears and throw yourself on the floor and grovel and weep and rend your clothes, rend your sackcloth, whatever, depending on if you live in the Bible or not. Or not. It doesn't demand, it is that way, so it actually doesn't demand any reaction at all. But it's all appropriate and quite understandable.
I was just thinking about the ways in which spiritual teachings are, taking them on so prescriptively, and just more and more seeing them as just sort of expressions of reality more than ways to find your way to reality. Although they can be that too, I guess. But.
Well, it's both, of course. Yeah. You know, the mistake is to be, if you're too heavy-handed and too formulaic, you have to do it like this, or this is the best. It's like, it doesn't work like that. By hook or by crook. Find it wherever you find it, and you can find it wherever you look if you're either artful or lucky. But from the point of view of yoga, the fortunate thing is that anywhere you look, you're looking at reality. So anywhere you look is a great place to investigate. Doesn't matter. So the implication of that is wonderful. You can spend your time looking where you're interested. You don't need to go and do all this horrible, boring stuff. You know, you can turn on the TV and watch your favorite show and have that be your spiritual path. You know, if you can do that artfully with wit, with subtlety, or eat chocolate as the ultimate, as the way to find God. Whatever that is, totally doable. Because unreality does not exist. So if you're in experience, you are engaged 100% completely with reality. There's nothing else to be engaged with. So just check out what is there and the way that it's there. That's all. Very simple. And it's especially simple because you're already always doing it. So it's not even, you don't even need to actually do anything that you're not doing. So
So is it time to break out the champagne and just celebrate?
works for me.
It's always that time.
Yeah. It's always Miller time.
It's fun having these machines that talk to you.
They came just in time, didn't they?
were speaking at the outset about this sort of subjectivity and objectivity, and how convincing that can often appears to be. My own sense is that it seems like, and you using the dream analogy as a way of kind of seeing through that, seeing that some unknown is sort of generating both the seeming subjective world and the seeming objective world as in the dream. It seems like to what's helpful in my own experience is recognizing what we call the objective world is experience.
Mhm.
And in that sense is not any different from what we call the subjective world, but they're
Exactly.
both essentially experiences.
Yeah.
And somehow in seeing it as just as experience,
Yeah.
that seemingly rigid line between subjective and objective just doesn't hold.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. That's the point. As you see, it's all just this experience. It's all the same thing, and it happens in the same way. And so all of these sub-qualifications, subjective or objective or material or immaterial or whatever and whatever, are just spin doctorings of something that is actually all one thing that happens in one way. That's the finish line. That's the punchline of the joke.
Or as you were saying, you could call it just presence instead of experience.
I like the term presence. Experience is obviously a fine word and certainly hits the nail on the head. But experience still has implications of its experience. It's my experience. It's there's an experiencer or whatever. I mean, not that it necessarily has to imply that, but those things are sort of floating in the wings just by habitual usage. Whereas presence is sort of, the implications of that are sort of intrinsically and inclusively impersonal and just across the board. And also, presence is an intuitively obvious quality. I think, that experience is present is really undeniable and obvious, even though you can't possibly say what or pin down what that is, of course. But presence is an actuality. It's an actual, undeniable, felt quality that applies really explicitly across the board. Am I thinking? Thought is present. Am I seeing? Vision is present. Experience is present. And it's all the same presence. It's not like there's objective presence and subjective presence. It's just, but really that's just a matter of convenience of using words and, of course, completely beside the point. But yeah, for sure. I mean, all this is really about is what is experience. And of course, this is itself the answer to that. There's no verbal answer.
Would you say that that's necessarily a refutation of what we think of as the external world, or not?
Of course. I mean, it doesn't negate the external world, but the external world becomes a subset of experience, just like the subjective world becomes a subset of experience. So whatever the external world is, to understand that, you would have to understand what experience is.
The experience is primary.
Yeah. I mean, empirically, it just is.
Right.
The experience, the so-called objective world exists because of experience.
But then you're talking about experience. I'm just stripping on these words a little bit. Experience as something's happening, as opposed to I'm trying to understand experience as presence. So
where's the opposition? If there's something happening, it would have to be present to be happening, wouldn't it?
Okay. I'm wanting to get a handle on the other.
There's no other.
I know.
There's no other, there's no distinction. The point is that everything converges. There's only one thing here, and it only happens in one way. So there's no point. Ultimately, there's no future in drawing distinctions.
You're always mean to me like that.
Not me. Reality's mean.
Somebody. I really would like to understand more about what is, and words is my little
What is it you're
entree.
not understanding?
I don't know how to put it into words, because if I did,
Well, try. I mean, just do it badly, and I'll try and make it jump.
whatever it was you were saying, I was getting tripped up about the interchangeable word of experience, presence, because
Right. Experience and presence are the same word.
that's what I thought.
Just put in equal signs, and then you can substitute one for the other arbitrarily with no harm, no foul. Does that address your conundrum at all?
Well, I'll have to see. I'll have to
Okay,
let it
fair
so.
enough. Mhm.
And noticing equals noticing.
And noticing. Equals everything else. I mean, the simple way to do it is take any word, put an equal sign after it, and then put any other word next to it.
Technically, you should put two equal signs, say it's equivalent.
Well, no, but that's pushing it. I'll settle for one. It may or may not be equivalent, but it's the same.
Okay, so I don't know, is there anything more you could say about presence cannot be divided out to me versus other? Maybe
Well, sure it
an
can.
elaborate,
Well, sure it can,
oh, it can?
but not actually. Presence can be sliced and diced as many times as you want, as we all know. Look
Yeah.
around at all this human endeavor.
That's the world I
But when that happens, nothing has happened. Because you haven't actually gone anywhere, you're still just in presence. Presence has a miraculous property of being infinitely subdividable without ever departing from itself. So you can break it into a bazillion pieces and there's still only one piece. Don't ask me to explain it. I just report the news, I don't make it.
There's two things with presence. One is that in spiritual circles, when they talk about presence, people think my presence, as opposed to the whole field is presence.
Well, there's no difference.
Yeah.
Your
Well-
presence is the whole field. There's only one presence for you, which is your presence, which is the presence of the whole field
Okay.
for you.
Okay.
Your field doesn't exist for me. Your field has zero presence for me. But that's your problem. My problem is the presence of my field.
It's not my problem.
I know.
And the second thing is that presence feels that sometimes it's construed as a steady state, and actually it's more like what you've referred to as a standing wave.
But you can't say what it is, but sure.
Mm.
It's unresolvable. So it may include any and all modes or not. Or both include and not include. And who knows? But since it's unresolvable, it's moot trying to resolve it.
Well, it's just not the point being it's not just a static, plot.
It's inclusive. Whatever it is, it never departs from itself. It never gains anything, it never loses anything.
And it's constantly emerging.
Sure. If anything's constantly emerging, it's constantly emerging. I don't know that you could actually find emergence, because I don't know that emergence would resolve to emergence. There certainly can be argued to be apparent emergence, but you can't actually ever find it. So it's a little iffy. But you can't find presence either. I mean, there may or may not be emergence, but you can't find it. There may or may not be the actual instantaneous presence. In other words, now may not really be here, because you can't really find that it is. Kind of seems to be. But since it doesn't resolve as that, but in emergence, you can't find any creation, you can't find any appearance, you can't find any disappearance. And if you look at apparition, you can't even find that. But on the other hand, there it is, so go figure. You try and make sense of it. Good fucking luck.
Okay, so I'll get personal with you and ask, so from the perspective of whatever this is, when you see the world, when you see this, and what does it look like? I mean, I know that you see these little bodies here, but would you give us a little taste of,
I can't say. I can't answer that. Can't be said.
Why do you bother having these meetings?
I don't know. Pervert, I guess.
to torment me.
Do you think that everybody is at these meetings other
I have no idea.
than?
To torment us.
It's a kind of an art, for me, it's a kind of an art form, you could say. And I do it because I do it. It has nothing really to do with anyone else. I would do it if no one showed up. Although I might not stay very long. I might, who knows? That's an art form too. Sitting in an empty room.
Peter?
Yeah.
Here. In the exchange before with Nancy, you said something, you sort of said, many times I've heard you say this many times before, but you said something like, well, yeah, you were slicing and dicing.
Yeah.
But nothing happened.
Right.
So is that sort of like, well, we talked about this before too, but like when I dream, I really think something happened.
Right,
But
exactly.
nothing happened.
Right, exactly.
So that's exactly the same.
Precisely.
feeling. Okay. I never really connected that exactly.
Yeah, exactly. That's right on the money.
So translate that into our day-to-day life.
You can't tell if anything's happening or nothing's happening.
It is like a dream.
Well, I don't know. It may or may not be like a dream, but in particular, in terms of what Pam was talking about, is you can't tell whether anything's happening or not. It kind of seems as if it is.
Just like, I mean, in a dream, it seems like it is.
Yeah, and then you wake up and you realize nothing happened.
And when we wake up from this dream, it may look the same.
Well, even if you don't wake up, it looks the same. I mean, where's everything that happened for the rest from the previous part of your life leading up to this? Where is it now? Did it happen? I don't know. It's kind of feels like
And
it.
the older you get, the more it's like a movie. You
Tell me
know?
about it.
Well, you often talk about textures.
Yeah.
And the textures or
Yeah.
you get into the experience of something. And I played around with many times where I'll be thinking that I'm trying to, sense where I was 10 minutes ago or half an hour ago, and I experience what my mind does at that point. And
Right.
it's an ephemeral kind of experience
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
And then I try to remember, other things that are going on, and I start to see that ephemeral quality is right here.
Right.
There's no place that it's not.
Yes.
And so then it's actually just has a different quality to it, but it's still that same thing is running underneath the whole
Yeah. Always.
manifestation, so to speak.
Always. It's like an infinitely fecund field of implication
Yes.
without ever actually being anything.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, the textures, because I haven't talked about that explicitly, and that's really a nice key point in terms of this investigation. A really, really good way as a jumping off point for exploring the nature of actual experience is to feel the texture of it. So for example, here's your field of vision. What's the texture of light? And don't worry about what does that mean? Don't worry about it. Just feel the texture of light. Don't try and make sense of it. Approach it like a koan. Just feel the texture of it. Feel the texture of touch. Feel the texture of sound. Feel the texture of thought. Feel the texture of the subtle vibes that are outside of, your senses. Anything. Just feel the texture. Feel the texture of what's there. Because you're not trying to turn it. You're not trying to resolve it. You're not trying to, catalog it. You're not trying to file it away in your memory banks. Just feel it the way you would judge the temperature of water by sticking your finger in. You just feel it. You know, feeling what entirely non-verbal, non-conceptual experience that's just rich with meaning. And most importantly, it's rich with intelligence. So feeling the texture of your experience, you're plugging in very directly to the inherent intelligence, and you're bypassing everything that makes sense to you. You're bypassing all the words and all the thoughts and all the analysis. Because texture is pure intelligence. And so that way you very directly will be learning the mode of the inherent intelligence, which is so different than what we're used to classifying as intelligence with our analytical intelligence and so on. I love all the horns and street noises we've been having today. It's fun.
Nice texture.
Yeah, totally.
All the planets lined up when you said that too.
They're always lined up.
Maybe from where you are.
Pretty close.
Yeah.
Pretty dang
That's the
close.
point.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I'll pull them around so they're pointed at me.
Speaking of which, is there any better time than any other time? You did astrology.
Yes, there is any better time than any other time.
There is, I'm sorry.
The best time is the best time. And there's no time that you can know for sure isn't the best time. So as a rule of thumb, it's best to assume that it might be the best time and have at it. Because you might get lucky. It's kind of like trying to go to bed with my wife. Oh, sorry. Could happen. Oh, sorry. Wait a minute. Don't know where that came from. Hypothetically speaking, in someone else's marriage.
Your wife, what?
Treat it like a co-ed.
No, Stan, I was talking about your wife.
No. Stan's not my name.
Do you think that the whole project of science is a fool's errand in the sense of, I mean, it's been a part of my life for so many years. Just looking at, we were talking a little bit at lunch about this, like looking, say, psychologists looking to understand the causes of our psychological makeup, and which are, of course, unthinkably complex, even at a conventional cause-effect way of looking at things. It's still impossible to, even if we try.
Yeah.
But from another perspective, it seems like the instantaneousness of reality that seems, in a sense, all that's really knowable, that this is just here.
Yeah.
It just makes me, I guess, ponder that question about the utility of looking at some, as we do as humans, of understanding parent cause effect relationships.
Yeah, yeah. Well, science will never understand reality, but science is an exploitive art form that exploits reality artfully for its own spin-off effect. So the important thing that science generates is basically technology, because all the theories are ultimately going to be superseded within a decade or two. But that's irrelevant because we can build bombs and better ways to kill ourselves and so on and so forth. Or better mousetraps. Or whatever. So as all forms of human endeavor, it's an exploitive art form that explores the possibilities of reality from the point of view of keeping scientists off the streets and employed.
I mean, maybe in the case of humans, I mean, psychology as a science has endeavored to do sort of the same thing, and you could say to develop psychotherapeutic technologies,
Sure.
but failed in many respects.
Well, failed, but
To
also
the extent
failed and succeeded. You know, to say across the board that no one has benefited
Yeah,
from
no, I wouldn't say that.
psychotherapy or psychological investigation, I think is heavy-handed.
Yeah, you're right.
But they haven't got to the bottom of it, and never will.
Going at it that way. Yeah.
But in a sense, all of these, technologies, science and the various sciences in the various areas, just show the cutting edge of human exploitation of the possibilities of what they understand about actuality. But of course, they're never going to get to the end of that. Because there is no end. Oh, there's always more. There's always the next layer which will supersede the last layer. And that's fine, because that's just it's like trying to get to the horizon, You march all day and you've made enormous progress, but the horizon's still over there.
That's great.
But that doesn't invalidate it. It's all functioning is explicitly a way that reality is dancing with itself. And there's nothing here but reality dancing with itself. And if it bizarrely chooses to do it in the guise of apparent human futility in engaging in all these absurd things while we destroy the planet and so on and so forth, who's to criticize? If that's God's idea of a fun way to spend eternity, who's going to point the finger?
This is just an aside from that conversation, just in terms of psychotherapy. I mean, I think there's probably some merit to it when they were doing shock treatment. This is like a pattern.
Everything has its
interrupt.
all functionalities have their pluses and minuses. Everything across the board has its pluses and minuses.
I stick lobotomies.
We don't have to worry about much.
Peter, I find interesting to really kind of explore in your experience the whole thing of cause and effect. That pretty much becomes very interchangeable and meshes within itself, and you see right through it, because you start to see that you've been sort of been brainwashed with this idea that there's some kind of cause that got me to this point where these things are here. But if you look into it, you recognize that whenever you try to find out what a cause is, you're just spinning off a story and interpretation in the moment. So it just unfolds immediately and unravels the story about what got you here. So where did cause and effect come? Sure.
At the end of the day, with the slightest investigation, you will rapidly discover there's nothing but miracle.
Yeah.
And in the face of miracle, what more is there to say?
You can say that.
You can say anything you want. Call me anything, just don't call me late for breakfast.
No, I mean, any great scientist that's really looking at, well, they'll come, right? Because they'll say the same thing. It's just totally
Of
different.
course, of course.
They're faced with it. They're looking at it.
Sure. But that doesn't invalidate anything. That, on the contrary, is the basis for anything, and essentially the permission and empowerment for anything. But you're never going to add to or surpass the miracle. Everything will ultimately, and not even ultimately, but across the board in every which way, be the miracle itself. You can't add to it or subtract from it. But you have license to have at it any old which way you can, because that's the very mode of miracle.
So it's as I wish, right?
Of course, miracle is permissive. Miracle is enabling. And from the point of view of those of us perverse enough to want to look into all this stuff, that's wonderful, because miracle allows that. It allows the discovery of it at the basis of this, and doesn't even hide very hard or very convincingly. And that's great news for those of us that are that find ourselves drawn to this great quest.
Okay, so here's this question. There's no distinction, if I'm getting this, if there's no distinction between self and other, then all of this world manifests according to what I imagine.
No, you're making a leap there. There's no distinction between self and other, and everything manifests according to the way it manifests.
So what I've noticed is,
If it manifests.
okay, so what I've noticed is as whatever is going on, just bear with my language, more acceptance, less need to control. I'm finding that things just kind of amazingly fall into place in different ways, whereas before, there would be more conflict, there would be more disappointment, there would be more what have you. How I've understood that is that what's unconsciously imagined in here is I'm meeting it out there. That's that's a framework, but I'm trying to put it into do you
Well,
understand?
until you have to try to understand it, you're doing fine. In general, all of those conditions you describe are signs of effective yoga. They're signs of achievement in yoga, which means you're doing very well. So keep up the good work, but don't worry too much about the understanding.
Well, I'm working with clients,
No, I understand that.
and I want to know how to, put things into words that could be helpful or
Sure,
blah.
that would be nice.
But I mean, it seems like it is true. I mean, it seems like it's true. I've heard this metaphor where the screen, it's another concept. The screen is here, and everything that comes across it is what gets projected from my own mind. Is that, so if I'm into suffering, that's what's going to be showing. I mean, is that an accurate understanding?
No.
No.
Doesn't mean it's wholly useless necessarily, but it's not accurate.
Could you say a little bit more about what is or what isn't in that in that regard?
Well, what isn't is that you're, you know, you're supposing you know what your own mind is, but you're supposing your own mind is some entity that is somehow doing something and has the potency to do this a projection, and the projection is effective. It may be possible to see it in those terms, and it may even have meaningfulness to see it in those terms, but that doesn't mean it actually is that way. So the degree of meaningfulness you can get out of those kinds of models are down to your artfulness as a therapist, if in that context. So, you know, you talk about wanting to come up with good words and stuff like that. That's down to, again, your artfulness and your skill as a therapist. But that has nothing to do with saying the truth or saying actuality. It's more be artful deceit with the purposes of generating a useful effect within a therapeutic context. And that's down to the artistry of the therapist, ultimately, or to the synergy of the artistry of the therapist with the nature of the client, I would imagine.
But you did say something about a sentence or two back about the artfulness of the yoga.
Right.
When I described, so.
Yeah. When you described the symptoms you're experiencing, I said those are signs of effective yoga practice. So you're doing good. So my advice would be keep it up. Yay for the home team.
Okay. Worth the price of admission.
I mean, signs of progress in yoga are a general lightening up of oppression, a general, by degrees, whatever degree, a general sense of more openness, a general sense of less entrappedness, a general sense of more possibility, or let's say more fluid options, those kinds of things. And so if you notice that kind of thing seeming to show up in your experience, then those are signs of achievement in yoga practice. So, bravo. You know, but on the other hand, there's no limit to how far that can go.
Yeah, I'm game.
So keep up the good work. Yay for the home team.
The last thing I would have expected to hear from you.
That's my job. Don't take it personally.
Well, that was a good lead into my question. Yesterday, you mentioned that when you were 22, I guess you started experiencing relationship as transpersonal.
Everything is transpersonal.
Everything is transpersonal, yeah. And so I was wondering, A, what that was like for you, and B, what that was like for the people around you.
Well, for the people around me, you need to ask them.
Yeah. Yeah.
If they even know.
Well, or if you've noticed.
And for me, I don't know how I could put that into words.
What does transpersonal mean?
It means beyond the individual.
Mm.
In other words, what everything is beyond merely being itself. Everything exists in a context which transcends it, and the nature of that transcendent context essentially entirely, let's see, by implication, restructures what the individual seems to be. That's sort of an awkward, sloppy way of saying it, but.
So is there a way to cultivate that, or does it just show up?
Answer to the first, maybe. Answer to the second, yes.
Have you got any hints on the first?
Go for long walks in lightning storms. Wearing an aluminum hat and no shoes, with conductive oil on the bottoms of the soles of your feet. It might be one technique I could suggest. I'm among many, many others.
Getting back to electroshock therapy.
What goes around comes around.
So I'm curious. I'm finding myself here, like wanting to explore, or I'm exploring, like this belief in the perception of otherness of like
Right.
independent objects. So it's like when I look at you, like there, or anything, there's a belief that I'm separate from this. But when I investigate into it, when I kind of penetrate it with my seeing into like the texture of what this is,
Right.
or what you are, like,
Right.
I sense that I don't actually know that is separate.
Exactly. You find a textual presence within your experience.
Yeah, because I don't, and that, I think I've heard you say that, like, because you can never know what someone else, like there's like everything that I can experience, I can only experience my own experience.
Of course. Of course.
I'm saying that.
Or one might say, how can you know you're not dreaming now? In which case, I am something you're dreaming. In which case, I am an apparition within your experience, being generated mysteriously by the supposed dreaming. Or you could forget about dreaming. You could say, I'm just an apparition within your experience being generated by who knows what, mysteriously. That's being perceived within your experience, who knows how, mysteriously. And here we are. Sure. And that can be seen and felt as if it was otherness, obviously.
Yeah.
It's possible to see it that way. But it's also possible to see that way of seeing it is arbitrary, and it doesn't have to be seen that way.
Okay.
Because anything that appears within your experience is just an apparition within your experience at the end of the day. And you can't find definitively anything else about it whatsoever. You can't find what it is, you can't find how it is, you can't find, you're just left with question mark, you're left with mystery. And yet the fact is, the presence of your experiential field, which as far as you can tell alone exists, with everything and anything, to the extent there isn't everything and anything, appearing therein. Right?
Yeah.
Just look and see that the way that's the case. It's really pretty obvious.
So the rub is the belief system.
Of course.
Holy shit.
That's what we've been talking about all day.
I know, but to know it and hear it and to kind of put it together.
Yeah.
So, it's kind
A
of.
belief system is a way of seeing it, and any phenomena can be seen any possible way. And there's no way that it has to be seen.
Crazy.
Yeah, it is, sure.
It's effing.
And the mistake is to suppose that the way that you happen to be seeing it arbitrary is necessary, and that's the way it is, and that's the only way it is, and there's no other way it could be seen that would be true. On the contrary, you can see it any old which way, and they're all have equal validity. And from within the context of that belief system, they'll seem to be objectively true. I can believe that you all exist objectively in an objective world. I can believe that this is essentially a hallucination that I'm having, where you all are apparitions within my experience like a dream. I can believe either of those. I can believe probably an infinity of other things. What I can't do is know for sure that any of those are true. So all you have is the fact itself, which is simply this, and it's a question mark as to exactly what it is and how it is. So the advantage of seeing it some other way is not to find the right way to see it. The advantage of seeing it some other way is to show you the arbitrariness of however you're used to seeing it.
I was reading a spiritual book the other day that I didn't like.
Shame on you, Stan. How dare
You
you?
don't understand, I didn't like it.
Okay, you've saved yourself.
Thank you.
If you'd enjoyed it, we wouldn't talk anymore. But at least you didn't like it, so we can go on.
But I was talking about, when we get to this point, and then some people will get glimpses, and then there's a danger of going back to sleep. And I just found that kind of I thought it like bad advice, only in that it supposes that I'm sort of in control of the waking up thing anyway. And
For starters.
For starters, and what wakes up, if anything, that isn't already awake. And then, but to put it all in the sphere of self-assessing, which I think is quite a bit. The self-assessing is kind of it's such a weird activity.
Well, but plus it's absurd because it's hopeless.
Yeah.
There's no way you can possibly self-assess. Because as with any assessment, you'll find yourself with arbitrariness.
Yeah.
Can this be seen to be this way? Well, sure. Can it be seen to be that way? Well, sure. So what?
Yeah, well, it's just the thing that the whole idea of you know, what's doing the reporting and what are you reporting to, and what.
Sure, exactly. But all of that, again, is not so subtly predicated upon the fantasy of resolvability. You can tell that what something is, and you can tell the way in which something is. None of which is even remotely true. And so when you see that, then you see the absurdity and the arbitrariness of all these modes. These modes may be fine, but they certainly aren't true. And they certainly aren't, the only mode, and they certainly aren't the best mode. They may be viable modes. Can you approach it that way usefully? Sure, maybe, why not?
I'm liking the book even less now, but
you can stay.
I know a lot of it was that they're talking from the social point of view of turning your attention around, looking at all these things. But there's like 6 different.
That's not a Dzogchen point of view. That's a bullshit point of view. Posing as Dzogchen.
Yeah. Okay.
This wasn't Peter's book.
Hey, none of that. That's bordering on sacrilege. No, I don't even like my book, so you can. It's free for all on my book all you want. My book sucks. I was trying to write another book and I failed, so I wrote that book. I've never liked it. I read it through a couple of times and I couldn't find anything to criticize in it, but I still don't like it. So if you don't like it, we're in the same good company. We're both in bad company.
So if I'm not believing, this may make no sense. If I'm not believing, well, maybe it's, if I don't put my perceptions as a belief, maybe that's it.
What do you mean by perceptions?
Well, so I'm believing that I'm seeing you sitting there.
Right.
So I don't know if it's like, question everything or.
Well, it's simpler. Question anything. Anything, if there's a thing, question it. Because there's not really anything. So question everything is too weak. Question anything.
Anything.
It's not, you're not negating it. You're not negating me being here, but there's
Okay.
no me and there's no here. So the thingness of me being me and here being here, and whether or not I'm here objectively or subjectively, there's way too many things on the table there. Take all those things and knock them off the table, and what's left? Just this. Am I here? I don't know. Are you here? I don't know. Am I objective or subjective? I don't know. So no things on the table, good table.
I don't even know why I'm
Now
laughing.
just knock the table, so there's no table, and then we're good. And it's important to notice that you're not actually negating anything in all of this.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
You're just negating holding these things as being a certain way. And in the open-endedness, they become more, not less.
Yes.
When you make thingness about conditions, you're actually diminishing them. You're making them smaller. You're making them diminished, caricaturized, pathetic, versions of them, oversimplified versions of them, whereas the actuality is an open-ended infinity of endless possibility. So you're making your world and you're making your situation smaller by entifying them, by thinking them. So you get rid of the things, or see that thingness is arbitrary and imaginary, being imputed to actualities that cannot be found as things. When there's no things, that's a big win. It's a big gain. Quite a load off too.
And this must be what it means to lighten the sense of orientation.
Absolutely, of course. Feel how much lighter your sense of orientation is when there's no things to populate it.
Wow.
What exactly was oriented to what? Where? How?
What happens if we can't find our way home?
I guess you go somewhere else. Always remember, no matter where you go, there you are. But that's always the case. What's always going to happen if you can't find your way home? That's always on the table. What's your excuse? Who am I? What are we doing here?
I noticed that this kind of seems to work just fine when you don't even worry about how it's going to work. It just does itself.
The point is, functioning has never happened because you know what you're doing. There's a big pretense that that's the case. We pretend we know what we're doing, and we pretend we can function to the degree we can because we know what we're doing. And that has never been true. Functioning always happens spontaneously and miraculously. And pretending you know what's the case has absolutely nothing to do with functioning. Functioning is always a miraculous direct energy presence. Which is why functioning is irrespective of process. You can teach exactly the same task to a dozen people, and they'll all do it with different skill levels in different ways. And it has nothing to do with what you taught them. It has to do with who they are and what their city is, what their energetic nature is in terms of the way they can dance with energy, which is inherent, it's inborn in the nature of their subtle energy anatomy, you could say. I got a rise out of Peter.
Well, even as I'm talking, I mean, experientially, right now, I don't know the words I'm going to say.
Who does?
It's flowing out. You can tell by
I don't know what you're going to say either.
Yeah. I don't know what you said.
I have no idea what you said. Never have. Makes conversing so much easier. Don't bother with all of this exchange of information.
I'm a puppet master. I can make it say what I want it to.
It makes you wonder whether anything, we talk about conscious and unconscious, it makes you wonder whether anything is actually conscious in the way that we typically think.
Of course, all those qualifications are absurd. Everything is conscious, and or everything is unconscious. You know, the whole notion of conscious entities is absurd. There's this field, and this field is, as near as I can tell, pure intelligence, pure inherent intelligence. So what portion of it is more intelligent than what other portion of it? It's absurd. It's ridiculous.
And I meant in the way I was framing it fully clear, just also that sense of when we think of consciousness, like I know how I'm bringing this about kind of conscious, which is
Yeah.
just
But that's
not true.
No, that's always the spin doctrine.
Yeah.
That's always just, feebly claiming
Right.
things to be a
Yeah,
certain
that's
way.
like, talk about
I know what I'm doing.
the ultimate proof.
I know who I am. Yeah, good luck. Well, we're all strongly brainwashed in that it's urgent to to be able to come up with a convincing rationale for who we are and what we're doing here and how we're doing it, What are you doing here? Oh, well, I'm allowed to be here. Attending a spiritual meeting. But we're trained that it's important to be able to do that. Instead of being honest, I don't have a clue. I'm here. I don't know why I'm here. I want to be here. I don't know why I want to be here. I don't even know what I mean by want to be here, but here I am. You tell me what I'm doing here, please. I mean, our normal human mode is so funny and so absurd when you look at it in the context of the way things actually are. It's just so much of it is just this empty, blustering bravado of being a good bullshitter. I mean, you look at someone like Trump, and it's like he's all of us. He's just a good blustering bullshitter claiming to know something. Yeah, right.
It just magnifies that same sense. Yeah.
But he can pay people off.
I can be bought off. Try me. We're receiving. Available for the highest bidder. All offers considered. No offer too large. I don't know what good it'll do. I should have secret initiations. $20,000 gets you the top secret, super powerful initiation. Give you your own mantra and everything.
They do that.
There's possibilities here.
Yeah. You're dreaming them up one at a time.
Gosh.
And to think all this time.
I know, right?
Could have been on a yacht somewhere.
I've been giving it away. Now, for some bizarre reason, I have a Prometheus complex. So I'm compelled to give it away.
Mm-hmm.
Pity. I got the basis for a good scam here. And I'm just letting it slip through my fingers.
Well, yeah, but my wife said it's just an introductory offer.
Yeah.
Later on, the price tags.
That's right. First 10 years is for free. Maybe the second 10 too. If I live that long.
Yeah,
The jury's out.
The third 10, that's where you're going to get us.
that, or the fourth, maybe. Well, I am going to knock off. I actually went longer today than I was afraid I might be able to do. So that's a win. And I personally feel really good about the quality of our engagement today. So I hope you all have enjoyed it. I will be here tomorrow morning at 10. If you would like to attend, of course, you're more than welcome. And we'll see how long I can go then. Peter's taking bets. I'm sure there's a pool running.
That's how he makes his money.
And thank you all very much for coming. I hope you found it interesting or
Thank
enjoyable
you.
or amusing or
Thank
something.
you.
Thank you.